Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 1.1 of Mystery and Reason. And I call this a philosophical introduction to the course. So hopefully you'll get a feel for what that means as we go along here. Let me start in a somewhat unexpected place. The animals who wonder. So I would say that human beings are unique among animals in many ways. I think this is relatively uncontroversial. Sometimes we think of ourselves as very special, completely separate from other animals. Other times we think of ourselves as no more than uh, fancy monkeys. But let's try to pinpoint some of the specific things that we do, very obvious things that we do, that it doesn't seem like any other creatures that we know of can do. So I made a list here. We cook food. As far as I know, we're the only ones. Okay, what else? We read and write. I didn't say we use language because there's definitely uh, forms of communication between lots of different types of animals, and there's no reason not to call that language. You could even call it spoken language when birds and, other creatures are making calls at each other. They have some sort of spoken language using sounds, but as far as written language goes, and the ability to read that writing, I think that is something that's unique to human beings. We laugh and we weep. That's somewhat of a deeper one, perhaps. Of course, reading and writing involves a lot of sophistication of intelligence, or what we would normally think of as cognitive capacities. Laughing and weeping, you might say, might show our emotional capacities as being more sophisticated. Here, I'll pause for a little quote here I found from an author, philosopher, I think, and a painter named William Hazlitt. In his work called On Wit and Humor, he writes this: The human being is the only animal that laughs and weeps, for they are the only animal that is struck with the difference between what things are and what they ought to be. So this adds another dimension to what I was just calling our emotional capacities. We don't feel emotions for no reason at all. We feel emotions when there are, you might say, moral issues at stake in some situation where things are not the way that they should be. That makes us not just sad in a way that, we might be sad that our, well, I don't want to put down any, minor forms of sadness, like our team doesn't win a game. We could weep at that, or we could weep at the unnecessary loss of life of an innocent person, to take a much more heavy example. In both cases, we have a feeling of how things ought to be, but the way they actually are, the way they actually turn out to be, doesn't match that. And so that's what causes our emotional reaction. And it seems like we might be unique in having that ability to think of how things should be. And that, you might say, is the source of our moral lives. Okay, what else? Oh, there's William Hazlitt, a self-portrait from 1802. Okay. Um, we do math. Okay. Maybe that's not the most interesting thing to you, so I'll just skip right over that and say we make art. How about that, right? We've been making art for a very long time. In fact, as far as I know, uh, pictorial art is older than written language. So, cave paintings and those sorts of things. So it's as old as humanity itself, you might say. Maybe the very same things that made us evolve out of whatever species we evolved out of were the very same things that made us do things like create representations of experiences that we've had. And that was, of course, the beginnings of art. We use money. Okay, we have an economy. We have, there's obviously lots of social and economic institutions uh, that humanity has developed. So we use money. We use other forms of currency and trade and whatnot. We wage war. So, the things that are unique about us aren't all fun and games. They're not all, positives. There's some, deeply dark aspects of human beings. You might even say that perhaps we are capable of both the greatest good and the greatest evil. And you might be like, I think maybe more towards the evil. Maybe it would have been better if we had never evolved in the way that we did. Maybe it would be better for the world as a whole. Okay, but on the other hand, we do hold ourselves to moral standards, as I was already starting to discuss with this Hazlitt quotation. So the fact that we are capable of saying that war is evil, or that genocide is evil, torture is evil, rape and murder, and all sorts of crimes that we're capable of understanding the immoral nature of, that capacity itself, you might say, is something profoundly good about us. Now, you might say, well, we wouldn't need that capacity if we weren't so evil to begin with. Maybe that's the case. Okay, so I won't try to expand on this much more. I'll just add one more to the list, and it'll be the one that takes us to the next topic. And I would say that among all these other things, one more thing that's unique about human beings is that we wonder. We wonder about stuff. We experience wonder. We ask questions. We want to know what's going on, right? Other animals know what's going on, but do they have a desire for knowledge? Maybe even a desire for knowledge just for the sake of knowing, right? So let's look into this idea of wonder. Let's wonder about wonder. What is wonder? I wonder. Okay. So what does it mean to wonder about something or to experience wonder? This is, by the way, image I found that takes a famous Escher uh, a work by Escher where I think it's a self-portrait of him looking in this sphere, but now it's the pondering my orb meme, which I think is maybe Saruman from a Lord of the Rings role-playing game book cover from a long time ago. Anyway, what does it mean to experience wonder? Well, it means to be curious, perhaps. If I'm curious about something, I just want to know. I wonder why something is the way that it is. I hear some noise outside. I wonder what's going on, right? I'm curious. I To wonder is to ask questions. Okay, this is going to be super important for this class. We're going to be focusing on the logic of questions and answers. When somebody is giving an argument to try to prove that something is true, they're usually doing that because they're trying to answer a question. And sometimes we forget about the question that they're trying to answer. It's sort of implicit or not directly stated, but they're giving this, speech or whatever, and they're trying to arrive at a conclusion. But why do we want that conclusion? Because it's the answer to some question. So when we start doing critical thinking material, starting in the next lecture, we'll be working up to that idea. Okay, but let me not focus in on critical thinking. I want to keep this very broad and philosophical right now. Not that critical thinking isn't philosophical, but you'll see that. Have you heard the phrase, "Don't miss the forest for the trees"? That means don't lose sight of the whole by being too focused on the minute parts, right? We're going to be focusing on the minute parts quite a bit in this class. We'll get into, some pretty gory details in terms of analyzing passages and arguments and things like that. But at this point, I want to stay with the forest. Okay, this is a big picture introduction right now, a philosophical introduction. Okay, so what does it mean to experience wonder? To be curious, to ask questions, to pursue understanding or knowledge. We want to understand how things work. We want to understand each other and ourselves, to ponder, reflect, or contemplate, looking into the crystal ball, thinking about our lives, right? To search for meaning, right? When we wonder, it's not just that we want to know facts, it's that we want to understand why we're here. We're wondering what's the point of all of this? Or, that could be life as a whole, or it could be some, you know, career or project, or, it could go from the big to the small. We want things to be meaningful. And if we don't understand the meaning of something, we wonder, does it have a meaning? If so, what is it? Right? To be awestruck. So wonder and awe often go together. When we experience, so you might look at my question and say, to wonder about something is a little bit different than experiencing wonder, right? To wonder about something is more active. It's like something you're doing. I'm asking a question. I am pursuing understanding. I am pondering, reflecting, contemplating. I am searching, right? To be awestruck is more passive. To experience wonder is something happening to me. It's something that I undergo. So when something amazing happens, when something just comes to me, or when I have a vision, whether it's with my eyes or in my mind, I might be awestruck. Wonderstruck, I think, is a word as well. And we might be like, wow, just, I'm rendered speechless, okay, by something that is truly awesome in the literal sense. Okay, well, let's bring it to one of the main focuses of the course, which is mystery. I think that the reason I'm talking about wonder is because it's closely connected to mystery. If we wonder about something, that typically means that we find it mysterious in some way, right? When there's a mystery about something that we want to know, we're curious, we're trying to figure it out, we're trying to understand more than we already understand. Okay, well, what does mystery even mean? Let's go back to the original meaning of the word. Since we're going to be dealing with mystery in many different ways in this class, we might as well understand where this word comes from. So here's a long explanation from one of my favorite websites. If you're into words and etymology, etymonline.com is like an etymology dictionary. It tells you where words came from. So the word mystery comes from the Greek words mysterion, meaning secret rite or doctrine, known and practiced by certain initiated persons only, consisting of purifications, sacrificial offerings, processions, songs, etc. That might not be what you expected. And it's related also to mustes, one who has been initiated. And in turn, these derive from an even more basic verb, muein, which means to close or shut. And that's where the word mute comes from. So when the mouth is shut, when you are mute, uh, that yeah. How does that relate to this sort of religious idea of a secret rites and doctrines? Well, they speculated in the etymology dictionary, perhaps we're referring to closing the lips in secrecy, so keeping your mouth shut about the secret rituals, or closing the eyes. Only the initiates were allowed to see the sacred rites. And I could just imagine also a situation where maybe when you're being initiated, you've got to close your eyes and things happen to you. And, there's all sorts of rituals going on. And then finally, once you've gone through they've purged you um, of your old self, then you can open your eyes and be part of this, spiritual, religious community or cult or whatever it may be. So this goes back to ancient Greece. That's where the word comes from. And there was various different mystery cults, they were called, sort of small religious groups. Often they were, um, worshippers of a certain deity from the Greek pantheon. The most famous one is uh, the Eleusinian mysteries. Probably should have written that down somewhere on the slide. Is this oh, and then there's the Orphic mystery cult. Yeah, so this is somebody's representation, Tyler Miles Lockett, of the Orphic mystery cult, uh, centered around the figure of Orpheus. And then there is, yeah, the Eleusinian mysteries that are focused, I think, on um, well, I know that somehow the when Hades takes Persephone down, kidnaps her and takes her down to the underworld, that's part of the core stories that they focus on. I don't know as much as I should, but mystery cults, that's where the word mystery originally came from. Okay. Another important concept while we're on this theme is mysticism, which is also clearly connected etymologically to mystery. Mysticism is defined as follows. So this is just from, I think, Merriam-Webster's dictionary. The experience of mystical union or direct communion with ultimate reality reported by mystics. Okay, so they're sort of defining mysticism in terms of the words mystical and mystics. Okay, but you could take that out and you could say mysticism is the experience of union or direct communion with ultimate reality. And the people who experience this we call mystics. And we call this whole experience a mystical union. Okay. And mysticism is the either the practice of trying to achieve these direct communions with ultimate reality or some sort of supreme being, or mysticism could be a more theoretical doctrine that says this is how we should practice religion or something like that. So not all religion is mystical in this way. Some religions hold us sort of at a distance from the supreme being. We worship them, but we're not trying to, and maybe we can, pray to them. Maybe, the priest or whoever is leading our congregation has like a more direct line of communication. But the idea of direct communion, having a sort of, experience in which one feels like they are one with the supreme being or God would be a mystical experience. Okay. This is Gustave Dore's wood engraving. He did a series of them to illustrate Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante wrote in the 1300s, I believe. He had the Inferno, the Journey into Hell, the Purgatorio, where he goes up the mountain of Purgatory, and then the Paradiso, where he ascends into the heavenly spheres. And this is at the very end of Il Paradiso, where he reaches the Empyrean, the highest heaven, and he has a vision of God and the angels that surrounding God and singing or whatever they're doing. So that's sort of a mystical experience, or is it? He's still standing there. He's with, I think, Beatrice, his lover, and they're still looking at it. They're not one with it, but maybe that's as close as we can get. Anyway, mysticism. Also, the belief that direct knowledge of God, spiritual truth, or ultimate reality can be attained through subjective experience. I already sort of mentioned that. I said mysticism can either be the practice of trying to achieve mystical union, or it can be more of a theoretical belief or doctrine that those experiences are possible and maybe that we should strive to achieve them. But mysticism can also be used as a pejorative term. Pejorative means like critical or mocking or uh, trying not to use another confusing word. Pejorative means sort of as a put down, right? Um, Maybe a slur would be a really extreme, pejorative term. Mysticism can be a pejorative term when it means something like vague speculation or belief without sound basis, or a theory that postulates the possibility of direct and intuitive acquisition of ineffable knowledge or power. And ineffable, that's another like SAT word. That means something like not able to be put into words. And so definition three here gives you the sense that mysticism is non-rational or even irrational. It's so there's rational beliefs, things that we believe that we have justification for, that we can either prove or give an argument for or support with evidence. And then the idea is mystical beliefs, or maybe religious beliefs in general, are vague speculations. They're beliefs without sound basis. They involve something that's ineffable that you can't put into words and you can't rationally think about or justify. Okay. So, so all these definitions I think are important. And I think it's safe to say that mysticism in one form or another can be found in essentially all world religions and spiritual traditions, although it might not be the main focus of most religious practice. There's usually, in the history of a certain religion, there will be certain figures that were mystics that had a direct experience of God or the gods, and then we tell the stories of them, and maybe we can be like them, maybe we can't. Okay. But one example that we'll look at towards the end of the course is the Vedanta school of Hindu philosophy. It's not always called a mystical tradition, but I think you'll see that it definitely fits a lot of the definitions up here. Okay, so we'll get to that towards the end of the semester. Okay, but now you might be wondering, all right, we introduced the word mystery. I told you about how it has these roots in ancient Greek mystery cults, which are related to mysticism. What about reason? That's the other word in the title of this course. Religious, as I was just pointing out, with the pejorative use of mysticism to mean something like irrational or unsound belief, religious mysteries and mysticism seem to be at odds with another essential aspect of human beings, namely reason. Okay. Of course, reason is involved in lots of the things I listed that are unique to human beings. Doing math, of course, using money involves a rational system of also involves math, of course. Written language, you might say, is something that comes from our power of reason to understand shapes and precise marks, and the fact that this symbol means the same thing that it did the last time it was used. Cooking food involves reason, understanding causes and effects, understanding, how the way that you prepare something affects how it's going to taste, or how it's going to affect your health and so forth. So human beings are often thought of as the rational animals. Okay. That's a traditional definition going back to the philosopher Aristotle. Humans are rational animals. We are animals. We have all the properties. We share lots of properties with other animals, but in addition to all that, we have something called reason. But what is reason? Okay. Here's a famous etching by Goya called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." I've never understood why he has the title written so big. I guess because it's not just, an artwork, it's some sort of um, message that he's trying to capture here, and he wants you to get the message and see the imagery. The sleep of reason produces monsters. And, as I was saying earlier, you might think that human beings, with all of our sophisticated rational capacities, are also capable of extreme evil. So I would say that the sleep of reason produces monsters, and maybe when reason is awake, it also produces monsters. Waging war, unfortunately, involves the use of reason as well. Um, but let me maybe just again balance that out by saying morality, the idea that there is a way that we ought to behave and conduct ourselves, that there are, virtues that we should aspire to, courage, generosity, selflessness, justice, that also comes from reason. And maybe Goya has in mind when moral reason is asleep, we get the monsters. Okay. Now, what is reason? Well, if I were to have you do a free association, why don't we try that? Write down three words that you associate with the word reason. Go ahead and pause the video and do that. So I wonder if any of those words were in my next bullet point here. Reason, I think, is often associated with things like logic, science, laws, analysis, lack of emotion, cool-headed deliberation, right? When we say to somebody, be rational, we're asking them to like hold back their emotions, to think clearly, to be logical, to follow like the steps of some algorithm, to follow some rules or laws, doing science. We're being very rational. It's what is often called left-brained, right? All these things. I think that's often where what the word reason gets lumped in with. But I want to suggest some other meanings of this word. Reason is also connected to being reasonable. I was just talking about moral virtues. Maybe this is an example of a virtue that we should aspire to, being a reasonable person or behaving in a reasonable way. What does that mean? Well, it means like being responsive to others. When you're saying you're just being unreasonable, it usually means that that person who's being unreasonable isn't listening to anybody else. They're just doing what they want to do and they don't care they're not trying to explain themselves. They're not trying to communicate or listen. They're not taking accountability. So being reasonable is to be responsive, to communicate, to listen, to take accountability, to explain yourself and why you're doing it, and modify what you're doing if you get, unreasonable criticisms. In general, to be reasonable, you might say, is to try to do things for good reasons. Now, there's another use of the word reason. So sometimes philosophers say reason with a capital R is like the power of reason, part of our mind that does all these things that we're talking about. And then there are like reasons with a lowercase r, which are the individual like reasons for things that you do or the reason why something is a certain way, right? So what's the reason for that? Or you think I should do that? Why? For what reason, right? So we can talk about reasons for beliefs. We can talk about reasons for actions. Maybe we can talk about reasons for experiencing emotions, right? Sometimes you might say it's reasonable to be angry about something. And then in another case, you could say, well, it's unreasonable to be angry about this other thing. Should I give examples? It's reasonable to be angry when there is a horrible injustice being done that you think needs to be corrected. And so you have a kind of moral anger that can, give you the energy to fight against the injustice. It might be unreasonable to get angry when to get really angry if you say stub your toe or, you know, um, somebody like cuts in front of you in line. Do you really want to get angry at them? That seems like a bit of an overreaction, a bit unreasonable, right? Of course, it's unreasonable of them to cut in line, but you could be reasonable with each other and discuss it, and nobody needs to get angry about it, right? Okay. Another connection I want to make to go back to what we started with is reason is even at the heart of the experience of wonder. Because when we wonder about something, we often want to understand the reason why it is the way it is. So when I talk about pursuing understanding and being curious and wanting to know, we want to know the reasons why things work the way that they do. We want to understand the reasons why people behave the way they do, and so on. So this ties reason back to wonder, but let me take that a little bit further. And now I'll actually introduce a specific philosopher who happens to be, I guess you could say, my favorite philosopher. I sort of have a love-hate relationship with him. I've been writing a dissertation to get my PhD on this philosopher for over 10 years now because he's very difficult to understand. He's very difficult to write about. I've changed my mind a million times about what I think he's saying, but I do think I understand quite a bit of his ideas, and so I'll try to share some of them with you on this slide and the next few slides. I've got some quotations, and I'm talking about the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Maybe you've heard of him. Kant is his name. It's usually pronounced Kant. British people, for some reason, say can't. Okay, and there's lots of puns that get made about his name. Anyway, his most famous work is called The Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, so it's definitely about reason, which is what we're trying to think about right now. It was written in 1781, and there was a second edition in 1787, I think. And he begins this book. It's a massive book, about 800 pages long. It was originally written in German, although Germany was not a country at the time. He lived in Prussia, which was sort of what came before Germany. But Prussia, it's very confusing. Prussia is not Russia. And yet part of Prussia at the time, the part where Kant lived was the city of Königsberg, which is very far east of most of Germany, and Russia now controls that city, and it's called Kaliningrad. Anyway, Kant lived there in the 1700s. He begins the Critique of Pure Reason with the following uh, pretty bold and interesting and intriguing statement. Here he goes. Human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its cognitions that it is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, since they are given to it as problems by the nature of reason itself, but which it also cannot answer, since they transcend every capacity of human reason. All right. That's a long sentence. Well, it's not that long, but there's a lot going on. Okay. Um, let me try to simplify it. Human reason is burdened with questions which it cannot dismiss, but which it also cannot answer. That's the bumper sticker version. Okay. I actually have that on my car. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so what is he talking about here? Um, First of all, if you're wondering about one species of its cognitions, the idea is going to be, look, human reason has lots of cognitions. Cognition is roughly synonymous with knowledge or belief or thought. Okay, we have lots of thoughts, beliefs. We know lots of things. We cognize or have cognitions or cognitive states in our mind. Okay, and there's one kind of those that he wants to be focusing on. We'll find out what they are as we continue the quote on the next slide. But in this one area, we get questions that we can't dismiss. They're sort of forced upon us by the nature of reason itself. We'll have to think about what that is, what that means. But these questions that are forced upon us, we cannot answer because somehow they transcend, they go beyond our capacity to answer questions. So we're sort of in this frustrated state, this peculiar fate. Okay. I think in the end, he has he thinks that there's good news that we can actually answer the questions, but if we think about them in the right way. But hold on, we don't even know what these questions are. So let's keep reading. But before I go to the next slide, let me just point out that he's calling attention to the questioning aspect of reason. So hopefully you can see I'm trying to bring together mystery and reason, right? When there's a mystery, we ask questions. Reason is burdened with certain questions that it wants to answer. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. Let's see what this is all about. So, why does Kant think this? Why does he think we have this peculiar fate with our power of reason? What kind of questions is he talking about? And what can they tell us about the nature of reason? He said, so here's how he goes on. All right, this is a long passage. Reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. It begins from principles whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience, and at the same time sufficiently warranted by it. So, let's see, do I have an image here? Oh, yeah. Sorry, no, that's going to come later. All right, sorry. So, reason begins from principles whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience, and at the same time, these principles are sufficiently warranted by experience. By experience, he just means our ordinary experience of the world around us, pretty much. when we perceive with our senses, our physical environment, when we feel things in our body, when we, have, thoughts go through our mind, all of that can be thought of as part of our experience. Okay? Everything you could say experience just means everything we are conscious of. Okay? And he thinks that our experience, there's these principles that we have to use when we experience the world, and those principles are justified or warranted by the fact that they can be used in experience. We'll see what those principles are on the next slide. But just, or maybe I should tell you so that you can understand this passage as I'm reading it. The example of a principle that he has in mind here would be something like the causal principle, the principle that everything that happens has a cause that causes it to happen. Okay? So everything has a cause, or everything that happens in the physical world, let's say, has a cause. He thinks that's a principle whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience. If you didn't see things in terms of cause and effect, you wouldn't really understand the world that you're experiencing. And that principle of causality is warranted by the fact that it works. We can understand the world because we search for causes for things, we find them. It turns out they really are the causes, and we can predict that things are going to happen based on them. We can, retrodict and figure out what happened in the past based on our knowledge of causal connections, right? Cause and effect. Okay, so take that as the principle. He says, with principles like this, reason rises as its nature also requires. It rises ever higher to more remote conditions. But since it becomes aware that its business, there's a typo there, that its business must always remain incomplete because the questions never cease. Reason sees itself necessitated to take refuge in principles that overstep all possible use and experience. But it thereby falls into obscurity and contradictions, from which it can indeed surmise that it must somewhere be proceeding on the ground of hidden errors, but it cannot discover them, for the principles on which it is proceeding, since they surpass all the bounds of experience, no longer recognize any touchstone of experience. The battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. Okay, there's a lot going on here. Let me try to break it down on the next slide. All right. Here's some comic relief. So I told you there's lots of Kant puns. I actually do have a T-shirt that says this. I don't have the bumper sticker on my car, but I have a T-shirt with this. Anyway, what is he talking about? What are these unavoidable principles? Well, I already told you, but I'll tell you again. That reason begins with. Why do they lead reason beyond all bounds of experience? I haven't told you that yet. And why does this result in obscurity and contradictions? I haven't told you that yet. Okay. Well, an example of a principle whose use, typo, sorry, whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience is that every event in the physical world has a cause. We think things don't just happen for absolutely no reason, right? That would be, you might say, unreasonable of nature to work that way. We would never be able to understand anything if there was just uncaused happenings that just things that just popped out of into existence out of nothing, right? There's got to be some cause. We don't, it's not that we like know from like a God's eye point of view that everything has a cause. It's that we search for causes for things that happen, and we usually find them. Okay? That this is a principle whose use is unavoidable because we need it in order to understand how the world works, and it is warranted by experience. Every time we try to use it, we're usually successful. We figure things out by looking for causes, right? And so whenever we want to explain why something occurred, we follow this principle. And even if we're not like doing science, even if we're just having an ordinary experience of the world, um, we, you know, um, we still are looking for causes for things, right? We hear a sound and we look to see like what made that sound, right? We're always doing this. Okay. What was the cause of the sound, right? And we usually find things, or if we don't think that it had no cause. We just think, oh, I haven't found it yet. Or maybe it's gone and there's no trace of it except for the sound. Okay. We'll talk a lot about cause effect connections, by the way, when we get into our critical thinking analysis stuff. Okay. All right. So we use this principle in the course of experience, but think about this. The cause of an event is always some earlier event, and that earlier event must abide by the principle as well. We can use the principle for every event in the physical world to and look for its cause. So the cause of a certain event is another event which itself has a cause, and that event has a cause. And so there's a chain of causes, you could say, leading further and further back into the past. Until what? Ah, we see now that the questions never cease. That's what he meant by that. He said the questions never cease. We can always ask for further causes of whatever causes we've given so far or found so far. So it seems like we can never reach an ultimate explanation. We can never fully understand why something happened because we would need to know the entire causal chain that led to it happening. What does that go back to the Big Bang? But even there, like, we might know some stuff about cosmology and the origins of the physical universe, but we don't know, well, yeah, we might be able to, talk about that. We probably can't trace, the sound that I just heard in the other room back to the Big Bang, but maybe it does come from it in some sense. But more so, if we're thinking about something like the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe, this is where we're driven to ask metaphysical questions. Metaphysical sometimes means beyond the physical, but more properly in philosophy, metaphysical just means, or metaphysics is the study of the fundamental structure and nature of reality. So here are some examples of metaphysical questions. Is there a first cause? So does this causal chain go back to a first cause like the Big Bang or something like that? Or is the chain of causes infinite? It just keeps on going back and there's no beginning. Both of those seem a little bit hard to wrap our minds around because if there's a first cause, you might be like, well, why did that first cause happen? Well, no, you can't ask that. It's the first cause. There's no why. But that doesn't satisfy us. We feel like there's something that's not being explained here. We don't fully understand it. It pops out of nothing somehow. How does that happen? How could that possibly happen, right? If the chain of causes is infinite, that's also a little bit weird or hard to understand. You might think if there's an infinite number of things that have to happen to get to where we are now, how did all of that finish happening? The past has to have finished in order for the present to exist, right? So if there's an infinite past with an infinite causal chain leading up to the present moment, it seems like that infinite process has been completed. But can an infinite process be completed? It seems like that doesn't really make sense, right? So there's all sorts of perplexities, obscurities, contradictions that we get into here. Let's go a little bit further. We could even ask, all right, whether there's a first cause or an infinite chain of causes, the whole chain of causes, the universe, the physical universe with its causal chain, whether it's finite or infinite, is there a cause of the whole thing? Is there a reason why anything exists rather than nothing? Philosophers usually put this question in the form, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Well, if there's a cause of the universe as a whole, maybe it's something like God, a supreme being that creates the universe out of nothing or out of God. God somehow creates the universe out of God themselves. But of course, you could still ask, if God is the cause of the universe, is there a cause of this God? And that's a more, whoops. that's a more serious problem than you might think. So from the point of view of, religious practitioners, you don't need to say that God doesn't need to have a cause. God is the only thing that doesn't have a cause. God caused themselves to exist. That's what God can do as the supreme being. But if you're allowing yourself to say that, why couldn't you have said that one step earlier when we said the universe doesn't have a cause, or it has a first cause and there's nothing beyond that? So the Big Bang, from the point of view of some physicists, is an uncaused event. And from the point of view of some religious people, that's not good enough. We want to know why that happened. But if you say, oh, there's a God that caused it, and then you don't want to say what caused God, you realize that there's not so much of a difference perhaps between saying there's an uncaused event or an uncaused supreme being. Okay, so this is getting us into problems in the philosophy of religion, which we will also deal with. Um, Problems like this when we get to those topics later in the course. And we could also just ask ourselves, we could step back and say, can we even use reason to answer such questions? Or, as Kant said, remember, do these questions transcend every capacity of human reason so that we cannot possibly answer them? And like I said, I think in one sense, he wants to say they do, in fact, transcend every capacity of human reason and we can't answer them. But in another sense, he has a way of reinterpreting some of these questions so that we can answer them, but just not in the way we might have thought. But that takes a little bit longer to explain, although I'll give you some taste of it um, in one more Kant quote that I've got for you. It's another kind of long one. Here we go. So this is it's a really famous passage, and we've got to do it. Okay, this is like the passage that brings together mystery and reason in the best possible way, at least from my point of view. But I'm a Kant fan, a Kant stan. Okay, so in the sequel to the Critique of Pure Reason, which is called the Critique of Practical Reason from 1788, Kant, I forgot his name here, Kant compares and contrasts two uses of reason: the theoretical and the practical. You could say the theoretical use of reason is the scientific use of reason, and the practical use of reason is the moral use of reason. Okay? So practical might not mean what you think. Okay? For Kant, practical is always connected with moral. And you'll see what I mean by that. So the first of these uses of reason, the theoretical scientific one, is what we've been talking about so far. That's what allows us to know the causal laws which govern nature. The practical moral use of reason is what allows us to legislate moral laws according to which we, as free agents, should act. So Kant thinks that we have free will in a sense and that's something else that makes us unique among other creatures. And what he means by free will is we are capable of behaving in such a way that can be governed by moral laws. And those moral laws are completely different from natural or physical or causal laws. So here is his very memorable and famous passage at the end of the Critique of Practical Reason. He writes, two things, here they are, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. So this is usually just called the starry heavens above and the moral law within passage. But it goes on. Okay, the starry heavens above me, that's the physical world in all of its glory, the universe. The moral law within me, that is something fundamentally different in Kant's view. Okay, this is supposed to be an image of the ideal of world peace. It's hard to get images for the moral law. This is the best I could do. Okay, he goes on. The first, so he's kind of talking about the first and the second. The first is the starry heavens, the second is the moral law. The first, the starry heavens, they begin from the place I occupy in the external world of sense, the world we perceive through sense experience, right? It begins there and extends the connection in which I stand into an unbounded magnitude with worlds upon worlds and systems of systems. By systems, he means star systems and galaxies, perhaps. The second, the moral law, begins from my invisible self, my personality, and presents me in a world which has true infinity, but which can be discovered only by the understanding, or reason, you might say. And I cognize that my connection with that world is not merely contingent, as in the first case, but universal and necessary. I'm not going to try to explain every aspect of this quotation. I just sort of want to, blow your mind a little bit by the sorts of things he's saying here. Um, so he talks about the unbounded magnitude of the physical universe, and then the true infinity of the moral world. And we have a contingent connection to the physical world. Contingent meaning it could have been otherwise. I could have been born somewhere else. I could have been born at a different time. The specific things that happen to me based on my environment are contingent. They're sort of some of those things didn't have to happen the way that they did. So my interaction with the physical world has all sorts of contingencies, but he thinks that our connection with the moral world or the moral law is universal and necessary. It always binds us, it always obligates us to be morally good, even when we're not, even if we, no matter when and where we were born, he thinks there's a universal moral law that comes from reason itself. That's a very controversial point of view in moral philosophy, but um, we're not going to get into why he thinks that right now, at least. Let me finish the quotation. He finishes as follows. The first view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as an animal creature, which, after it has been for a short time provided with vital force, must give back to the planet, a mere speck in the universe, the matter from which it came. So if all there was the physical world and my existence as an animal creature, then I have a short lifespan, all things considered. The entire planet we live on is a mere speck in the universe, and there's nothing more to us than that. And so you might say that we are, very insignificant. We're insignificantly small compared to the universe as a whole. However, he thinks the second, the moral law, on the contrary, infinitely raises my worth as an intelligence by my personality. Personality means something more than like what we would normally mean by that. It means something like my character, my like moral character. So the moral law infinitely raises my worth uh, as an intelligence by my personality, in which the moral law reveals to me a life independent of animality and even of the whole sensible world, at least so far as this may be inferred from the purposive determination of my existence by this law, a determination not restricted to the conditions and boundaries of this life, but reaching into the infinite. Okay. And I'm not going to try to explain this. I just want to kind of give you, hopefully, an awe-inspiring vision of human beings as having something very special about us, that we are capable of morality, that we're capable of trying to create good in the world, that isn't limited. Our powers to achieve good are limited, but our intention, our desire to make the world better is not limited. Even in most extreme forms of suffering and torment, we see examples of human beings who still try to do what is right. And I think that's what he means here. Okay. Okay, let me just start wrapping up. But in order to do so, I should set us up for the other part of the course. I've been talking about philosophy, I've been mentioning some things about critical thinking. What about mystery in the way we normally think of it as a genre of fiction? Okay, so we've been talking about the big mysteries that we face in religion, in philosophy, or when we like deeply reflect on our lives and on the world. But of course, there are also much smaller mysteries, local, mundane, you might say, mysteries, both in mystery fiction and, of course, in real world criminal investigations and scientific investigations, I should say. So the word mystery has been in the English language since the 14th century, and it meant things like mystery cults, okay, or, secret, religious doctrines. The word mystery was first used for the genre of detective stories in 1908, so only a little bit over 100 years ago. And here is an early issue of the Mystery magazine from 1934. Here's a definition from Wikipedia. Since we're going to be reading a lot of mystery stories, we might as well know what they're supposed to be. So, mystery is a fiction genre where the nature of an event, usually a murder or other crime, remains mysterious until the end of the story. Often within a closed circle of suspects, each suspect is usually provided with a credible motive and a reasonable opportunity for committing the crime. The central character is often a detective who eventually solves the mystery by logical deduction from facts presented to the reader. Okay. So you probably knew that, but it's good to at least ground ourselves here on a clear uh, definition of the mystery genre. And let me just give you a very brief history of mystery. Um, I haven't read most of these, but I looked up sort of the most famous, most well-known early works in the mystery genre, which goes back quite some time before the word was first used, before 1908, I guess, when it was first called mysteries. So it's often thought that the first one is Mademoiselle de Scudery by E.T.A. Hoffman, I think originally written in German, but it's about a character in France, a female detective of sorts who uh, apparently solves mysteries. I haven't read it, but I actually got the a Kindle copy of this. I'm going to check it out. Edgar Allan Poe, I'm sure you know. His first main mystery story was called The Murders in the Rue Morgue from 1841. Oh, Mademoiselle de Scudéry was 1819. We've got Wilkie Collins, The Moonstone from 1868. I guess that was the first full-length mystery novel. I think this is Mademoiselle is a short story, as is Poe's Rue Morgue. Arthur Conan Doyle, we can't forget him. A Study in Scarlet, that was the first Sherlock Holmes story from 1887. Maurice Leblanc, The Arrest of Arsène Lupin from 1905. Franklin Dixon, you may know The Hardy Boys. I don't know. I read some of these as a kid. I had no idea that the first one was written in 1927. And Carolyn Keene, the Nancy Drew stories. The first one was in 1930. Fun fact, these are actually the same person, the same author. Actually forgot his real name. I should have put it in the slides, but he has two pseudonyms. Franklin Dixon was the pseudonym for the Hardy Boys, Carolyn Keene for the Nancy Drew stories. And let's put in Agatha Christie, very famous, Murder on the Orient Express from 1934. So I didn't assign any of these classics of the mystery genre the last time I taught this course, but I'm thinking I'll try to get at least one of these as one of the readings at some point in the course. Okay. Just one last slide here. So Poe described his mystery stories as tales of ratiocination. Ratiocination, hard to pronounce. To ratiocinate, obviously it comes from the same root as rational, which is the Latin word ratio, which means reason. To ratiocinate is a fancy word for to reason, to infer, to argue, to compute, to reckon. Okay. Conan Doyle took ratiocination to the next level with the character of Sherlock Holmes, who is known for his proficiency with observation, deduction, forensic science, and logical reasoning that borders on the fantastic. Okay, so we will think of Sherlock Holmes as a kind of ideal that maybe we can try to live up to as we learn our critical thinking skills. Okay. Here's some fun facts to leave you with. By the 1990s, this is about Sherlock Holmes, over 25,000 stage adaptations, films, television productions, and publications had featured the detective Sherlock Holmes, and Guinness World Records lists him as the most portrayed human literary character in film and television history. I find that pretty surprising, but I guess it makes sense. Avid readers of the Holmes stories helped create the modern practice of fandom, with the Sherlock Holmes fandom being one of the first cohesive fan communities in the world. So I thought you might find that interesting. All right, so we will be doing mystery and reason, and hopefully you have some sense of how those are connected from a sort of philosophical point of view, and then we'll get into the critical thinking uh, stuff in the next lecture. All right, I will see you then, or you will see me. Bye bye.